She was in her mid-teens when they adorned her in fine fabric and escorted her into the subterranean chambers. For 3,000 years, the story of ancient China's greatest dynasties has been told through kings and generals. The Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, names carved into bronze and bone. But there is another story buried beneath the palaces. One written not in bronze, but in bone. The bones of young women buried alive beside men they may never have chosen. And now, DNA is finally letting those women speak. The practice was called Xunzang companion burial, but that name hides what it actually was. When a Shang king died, his household died with him. Concubines, servants, guards, horses, dogs, all followed the king into the earth. The largest Shang royal tombs at Yingshu contained over 300 sacrificed individuals in a single burial. 300 people killed so one king could be accompanied in the afterlife. The tomb structure tells the hierarchy. The king lay at the center in a lacquered wooden coffin, surrounded by jade and bronze. Around him lay the inner circle. Women in silk bronze mirrors beside their heads, jade pendants at their throats. These were the sacrificed brides, women chosen or captured to accompany the king into death. But for decades, everything known about these women came from their position in the tomb. No names, no origins. Then archaeologists started extracting DNA, and the silence broke. In 2018, a team from Jilin University published one of the first large-scale ancient DNA studies from Shang Dynasty burial sites. They extracted genetic material from dozens of individuals across multiple burial contexts at Yingshu and surrounding sites. The results split the dead into two genetic worlds. The elite burials, the kings and their immediate kin, carried mitochondrial haplogroups, common to the northern Chinese populations of the Yellow River Basin. But many of the sacrificed women carried entirely different lineages, haplogroups associated with populations far to the south and west. The brides buried with the kings were not from the same population as the kings. Strontium isotope analysis from their tooth enamel confirmed it. Many had grown up in geologically distinct regions, hundreds of kilometers from Anyang. They were brought to the capital from conquered or tributary territories. The picture that emerged was stark. These were not local women who volunteered for ritual death. They were outsiders, taken from distant communities, brought to a foreign capital, and killed. But the genetic evidence revealed something even more disturbing than their origins. The demographic profile of the sacrificed individuals was not random. Among the companion burials, the ones placed closest to the king, the overwhelming majority were female, and young skeletal analysis placed most between the ages of 15 and 25. Their teeth told the timeline. Dental development markers indicated most had not yet reached full skeletal maturity when they died. Oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang period referenced the selection process. Diviners asked the ancestors whether specific individuals should accompany the king. The bones were cracked with heated rods, and the cracks were read as answers from the dead. The language is clinical. Names are rarely given. The victims are counted like provisions. 10 women for the south ramp, 5 for the north, 20 for the outer pits. The accounting of death. The genetic diversity among the sacrificed women was significantly higher than among the elite burials. The elites were genetically homogeneous. The victims were a genetic mosaic from across the ancient world. This meant the Shang court was drawing sacrificial victims from a wide geographic network. Not one conquered village, many. The wider the net, the more powerful the king appeared. The practice was not just ritual, it was political, the ultimate demonstration of dominance. And the women at the center of it had no voice in the record until their bones spoke. But here is where the evidence gets more complicated. The Shang were not the only dynasty that practiced sacrificial burial. The practice continued in diminished form through the Zhou, appeared dramatically in the Qin Emperor's terracotta army complex. And then it came roaring back 1,000 years later under the Ming Dynasty. In 1498, the Hongzhi Emperor became the first Ming ruler to formally abolish the practice. But before that, at least dozens of concubines and palace women had been killed at the funerals of Ming emperors. The Ming records name some of them. Most are identified only by their rank within the palace hierarchy. Historical records from the early Ming describe the process. The women were gathered. They were given a final meal. Silken cords were hung from the rafters, and they were expected to hang themselves or be hanged. Those who resisted were strangled. The practice spanned 3,000 years, from Shang oracle bones to Ming palace records. And in every era, the same pattern held. The victims were overwhelmingly young women. Many were outsiders. The question DNA can now answer is whether this pattern reflects voluntary ritual participation or something closer to systematic enslavement and execution. And the answer is becoming clear. In 2021, a team led by researchers from Fudan University expanded the genetic investigation to include sacrificial burials across multiple time periods. They sampled skeletal remains from sacrificial contexts spanning over 1,000 years, from Shang through Zhou, through the early imperial period. The results confirmed what the earlier studies had found and pushed the evidence further. These women came from communities that were culturally and genetically distinct from the Shang ruling class. On principal component analysis plots, the sacrificed women scattered widely across the genetic landscape, while the elites clustered tightly together. Dietary isotope analysis told the same story from a different angle. The elites ate millet. Many sacrificial victims had been raised on rice. Millet was the staple crop of northern China. Rice was the staple of the South. Their teeth recorded which world they had grown up in. The evidence pointed to a brutal conclusion. The Shang court was importing people for sacrifice. They were not choosing from their own community. They were harvesting from the periphery. Kinship analysis made it worse. The sacrificed women in a single tomb were rarely related to each other. The elite burials showed clear family connections, parents, children, siblings. But the sacrificed women were strangers to each other, gathered from different communities, held together only by the fate assigned to them. But this is where the story gets more complicated, because DNA also found something unexpected. Not all the sacrificed women were pure outsiders. A subset showed mixed ancestry, northern and southern lineages combined. Their admixture profiles suggested they were the children of mixed unions. One parent from the Shang heartland, one from the south. Which means some of these women may have been the daughters of earlier captured women. Second-generation captives, born in the capital, raised among the Shang, and still designated for sacrifice. The genetic evidence suggested a multi-generational system: capture, incorporation, and then sacrifice of descendants. This was not a one-time act of war. It was a system that renewed its own supply. The DNA says this was not just cruelty. It was infrastructure. Skeletal pathology supported this reading. The sacrificed women showed higher rates of childhood nutritional stress than elite females. Harris lines on their long bones indicated repeated episodes of growth interruption, periods of hunger, illness, or physical stress during childhood. They had harder lives than the elite women buried nearby, even before the day they were killed. But does the DNA evidence actually prove they were unwilling? That is the harder question. Some historians have argued that companion burial involved a degree of consent, that in certain periods it was considered an honor. Oracle bone records do reference preparation periods, ritual cleansing, special garments, a ceremonial sequence that implies the victims knew what was coming. But the DNA evidence complicates any reading of voluntary participation. The victims were overwhelmingly from outside communities. If they had a choice, Why were almost none of them from the local population? The pattern of selection was not random and it was not voluntary. It targeted women with specific characteristics: young, foreign, low status. And the multi-generational mixed ancestry individuals proved the system was not just one of capture. It bred its own supply. A haplogroup does not prove coercion, but the pattern across hundreds of remains is overwhelming, and the pattern held across dynasties. When researchers compared Shang data to Zhou and Qin sites, the same profile persisted. Young non-local females remained disproportionately represented among companion burials, even as dynasties fell and political systems changed. The machinery of sacrifice kept selecting the same kinds of victims. The kings changed. The ritual justifications changed. The victims stayed the same. The Qin dynasty is famous for its terracotta army. 8,000 clay soldiers buried to guard the first emperor in death. But what is less well known is what else lay inside that mausoleum complex. Beside the clay army, archaeologists found real human remains. Dozens of skeletons in subsidiary burial pits. Historical texts record that the second Qin emperor ordered all of his father's childless concubines buried alive with him. The terracotta army replaced soldiers, but the women were real. Early DNA analysis from these Qin-era burials has shown similar patterns to the Shang data. The sacrificed concubines carried lineages from outside the Qin heartland in northwestern China. Southern and southwestern haplogroups appeared again. The Qin had conquered vast southern territories before unifying China. Those conquests supplied the dead 2,000 years after the Shang, a completely different dynasty, and the same pattern. Outsider women from conquered lands, buried beside rulers who saw them as possessions. Across 3,000 years and 3 dynasties, the genetic signature of the sacrificed women told the same story. They were not locals. They were not volunteers. They were drawn from a permanent underclass defined by foreign origin, and that underclass was overwhelmingly female and overwhelmingly young. What does this change about how we understand ancient China? For decades, sacrificial burial was treated as a footnote, a cultural curiosity in the margins of history. Textbooks focused on the bronze vessels, the oracle bones, the writing system, the achievements. The sacrificial dead were acknowledged, but rarely centered. They were treated as evidence of religious belief, not as evidence of systematic exploitation. DNA changes that framing completely. It identifies where victims came from and what their lives were like. They stop being a ritual category and start being individual human beings with traceable histories. Facial reconstructions based on the cranial remains of sacrificed women at Yingshu show faces that look different from the reconstructed faces of Shang elite women. The genetic ancestry that separated them is now visible. Different faces, different worlds, same tomb. For modern visitors, the reconstructions make the abstract real. These were not numbers in an excavation report. They were girls who looked like someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. The bones of those women still lie beneath a modern Chinese city. Thousands of them across dozens of sites. And the DNA technology that can finally tell their stories is still in its early stages. Whole genome sequencing from ancient Chinese remains is advancing rapidly. Each new study adds resolution to the picture. The next generation of studies will be able to identify specific source communities for individual sacrificial victims, not just Southern or Western. Yes. Exactly which village, exactly which family line. History remembers the kings, the bronze, the oracle bones, the conquests, and the calendars. It rarely remembers the girls who were dressed in silk and led underground, but their bones are still there, and their DNA is legible, and the evidence does not support any reading of consent. 3,000 years of silence. And now, the bones are speaking. If you found value in this investigation, subscribing helps this channel tell the stories textbooks leave out. The question that remains is not whether sacrificial burial was cruel. The DNA has answered that. The question is, what happens when we stop treating these women as footnotes and start treating them as the central evidence for how ancient states actually worked? Because the DNA is clear. The dynasty was not just built on bronze and bone, it was built on blood. Somewhere in a storage facility in Anyang, there are thousands of bone fragments still waiting to be tested. Each one was a person. Each one has a genetic story. And each story leads back to a community that lost a daughter and never recorded the loss. What happens when every one of those bones gets tested? What map of ancient suffering will the DNA draw? Sources and further reading are linked in the description below.